So the nice thing is we left off really just getting some kind of good color painting, talking about how we could use some of our masking features with that, right? And remember, for spotting and speckling, that can be useful. You just need a better image, right? So remember, one of the easy, quick things we could always do to load in any kind of textures we might want to use for these is, remember, you just go to the kind of red checkerboard here, right? Like I said, particularly if you're not using BPainter, BPainter makes that process a lot easier. It's kind of a whole little layer brush, image-based browsing menu system. It's quite nice. But go to the red texture and go to new. And then, of course, it brings up this, and this allows you to browse for outside images. So we can go to open, and we can go to wherever we saved stencils or textures. I did grab something since I didn't have a really great one last time. I did grab kind of a little something. Hey, good. Okay. So what we could do here is we see that we have this alpha, right? And we talked about this a little bit last time towards the end, but you'll see that we have this black and white image. Now remember, the white paints, the black doesn't paint, right? So what we could do is we can go to open image, and of course that texture is now loaded in. But you see how this will be a much better kind of freckling, right, than what we had last time. That was just kind of, I was just trying to find whatever I had on me here. I have a much better library at home, right? But kind of went and found this for you guys so we could briefly show it again. But this kind of alpha is going to work much better for whatever freckling you want to do. So remember, the black doesn't paint if you're going to use that for this kind of effect we're going to show. So that loads that in. Now, in this case, we're not going to use texture, right? It is available in the texture, and we've got viewplane on. But we see that it paints that whole image, right? And in this case, we don't want that. Sometimes you might, so it's not like that's something you might not want sometimes, but in this case, we didn't. So I'm going to go to texture here. I'm going to hit X, right, because that gets rid of it and unlocks out of there. What I wanted is I wanted texture mask. And you'll see that mask mapping, for a lot of the same options are still here. Not all of them. You'll notice that you'll have, like, what is it, like, I think 3D and random are here. Whereas in texture mask, you'll see tiled, stencil, viewplane. Now, viewplane is the one that you generally want to use if you want to stamp this down, right? Now, you'll notice that if we want a texture mask, right? Because what that's going to do is it uses the texture like a mask. And we're talking about a mask like masking off something for painting, right? Where if you have like some cutouts in some paper or like construction paper or cardboard, and you go to paint, wherever the holes that you made are at, the paint goes through there, the cardboard, it doesn't, right? Similar kind of thing here for texture mask, except the black is kind of like the cardboard and the white is the holes, right? So the paint can go through. So when you think about texture masking, really think about, kind of stencil masking that you would do to paint like text or a pattern on something, right? In this case, you go to the texture mask, and you'll see that there is, of course, new here, so you can always do new from there. But you'll notice that you can also just go right here, see the kind of little white checkerboard, and that will allow you to browse whatever texture you've loaded in. So the nice thing is once you've opened up a texture in Blender, once you've opened up a texture in Blender, it's in there, right? It's available to be browsed right here. So texture mask, remember viewplane gives us the proper ability to kind of stamp it down as a repeated pattern, right? So now you see if I go to paint it, you see how kind of it's painting on top. It's like stamp, 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 right? So this is the equivalent of what you would see as, like, say, stamps in some other packages. Mudbox in particular calls it that. ZBrush calls it alphas, right? There's kind of a couple of different ways you could use these textures. But what is happening is it's taking that image and it's placing it down and then placing it down and then placing it down and then placing it down almost on top of each other, right? So that's where if you go to something like, say, stroke, and remember, fall off, I usually set to smoother. If I go to stroke, remember there's spacing controls in here, right? And so I could set this to, say, like maybe 50% instead of 10%. And now you'll see there's more space in between them, right? And that will actually more effectively allow you to kind of drop that down as a freckling pattern, right? So regular space stroke with just spacing is actually quite cool. In fact, I might even turn it up to, say, like 70%. And of course, I've got the color set to white, but if I wanted this to be like a dark green, I could do exactly that, right? I go into the color here, Of course, we can make the strength a little lower for the brush. And you see how we can easily kind of do some neat little kind of freckle patterning, right? So there we go. Get a little bit of freckle patterning. If you want, you can kind of play with a little bit with jitter, right? Jitter is the position of the brush while painting. So there's kind of some cool controls you can play with a little bit there if you want to. So yeah, but this gives you kind of an ability to do a little bit of freckling. Maybe even add a little bit of jitter there. So it kind of sprays them around a little bit, maybe a little too much. But there's some cool controls there. And remember, you can play with different settings and stuff like that. So yeah, so just keep that in mind, right? That spacing control gives you some cool extra little abilities to kind of drop these in here. There we go. And that can just give us the ability to do some kind of cool freckling. But usually you want a higher spacing to get a freckling that looks a little more normal, right? There we go. Get some freckling. And of course, you could switch to other stroke types, right? So we've got the texture mask already on. I could switch to anchored, right? And remember, anchored allows you to kind of drag, drop that pattern. So if you wanted to kind of break it up a little bit more with some larger freckles, that is something you're very welcome to do also. So you see what you could do is you can actually drop these in. So remember, anchor gives you that kind of a little ability to kind of drag and drop. You can kind of move left, right. So you see how you kind of pull left, right, it kind of brings it out, makes it bigger, smaller, you rotate it, and we get freckling. Nope. So these are all cool ways that you can add freckle color patterning to your model. And of course, remember, these all work for our sculpting that we did earlier. So remember, texture mask actually masks out your color effects, and your different strokes give you different effects, right? Space versus anchored. Space just kind of keeps dropping it down right on top of each other as a regular brush stroke. Anchored is much more of kind of like you're dropping one, right? But you can control the size and the rotation of it. And this can do some cool freckling, right? And when you have B-Painter and a proper, easier to use layer system, it's even easier to kind of play with blend modes and things like that. But I just wanted to really make sure that you guys can fully appreciate that. Yeah, it would be nice to have a better layer system stock in Blender, but B-Painter gives you a great one for minimal price. But that the actual core painting tools in Blender without the layers are still quite excellent. You've got great stroke controls, a lot of the core features. And so remember, you have a lot of different strokes, and these modify and give your brush different behaviors. But you also have your texture versus your texture mask, right? Masking really just uses the light and dark pixels to paint a color or not color, whereas texture itself paints the exact image, right? Paints the exact image. So texture, you don't have to worry about that. Whatever it is, just paints it. Unless it's a decal, right? Unless you have an image that has no pixels in it, you guys can actually find some of those at textures.com. They're called decals. Those will actually paint the whole color and then just drop out the stuff. We're probably not going to do much with decals this term just because we're running out of time. And, you can't fit everything in your brain in 1 year. But decals can be cool in themselves. But they're actually, the texture itself's already prepared, where it's a regular texture, paint it like regular texture, but it actually has empty pixels on it. Not black pixels, but no pixels in certain parts. And so you could use it in regular texture and just paints without it, right? I feel like I actually do have one, so I could probably show you really quick. But remember, go to texture mask, right? And in this case, I'll just kind of turn this off. I'll just hit X. So remember that little X turns it off here. It doesn't get rid of it. It's not deleting it out of Blender, but it kind of turns it off as what's being used currently, right? But it's still there. So these are some of those neat things that you could do with Blender. And you see how much this just gives you variation, right? This is automatically looking more interesting than it did before because we've got the kind of freckling we'd see on stuff. We've got lighter and darker tones of range. So these are the things that are going to make your texturing a lot more interesting on your models, right? So of course I could load in anything I really want, right? I could load in an image here to a stencil paint with. because in this case I do want an exact image for this one. So of course I could go to New, and I can go to Open, because I still have the kind of red checkerboard down here, the magenta checkerboard. In this case I can just go down to Stencils, and I have a much more extensive library at home. I just have some stuff I've gathered here and there when I needed it for class lectures, right? But I have like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of textures, easily probably over 1,000 plus at home for my stuff. Here, I've got like a couple dozen, right? So I could grab something maybe like this. This might work. It's kind of iron, but it kind of works for horn too. So when you look at like metals or fabrics and things like that, or even like paper bag stuff, I've used paper bag textures for fabric, right? Don't get stuck on, oh, this was a metal in the metal category on textures.com. Sometimes it might actually work great as a bone stand-in, right? So really, when I grab textures, obviously, I look for metals and fabrics and things like that, but I don't limit myself to thinking I can only use that as a metal, right? So I can grab that image right there, open that up, and in this case, we actually want to specifically paint exactly this, right? We saw that with just viewplane, right? In here, that just kind of paints it, kind of just dropping on the model, right? It's just the regular brush stroke you paint, and it's drop, 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 unless you use anchor, and then it's kind of like drag it to drop it, drag it to drop it. But that gives you some really cool effects also as well, right? You saw I kind of use that to randomize and kind of make it more broken up and more naturalistic. In this case, though, I want exactly this image, and that's where stencil is much better, right? If you're just doing kind of more of a randomized kind of noisy pattern, like freckling, your regular view plane stuff with space and some spacing or, anchored is going to be great. But when you actually are wanting to paint exactly an image, you really want specific parts of this image, that's when you paint it. Yeah. So in this case, we want to go to texture, right? Not texture mask, right? That's off. We've kind of cleared that. We want to go to texture mask. And you see it's already loaded in here, and it's kind of on, right? But in this case, I don't want view plane. I mean, we could use view plane, right? Let's make sure your color tints this. And that's actually pretty common in a lot of applications. Mudbox, some of you guys remember we did Mudbox last year? Mudbox did this. So believe it or not, the actual color that you have set on your draw brush does matter, right? So I'm going to set it right kind of back up to really close to a white. Basically, white paints it exactly as it is. Any other color will tint it. And the darker the color, the darker the tint. If you have black, it will basically just paint black, right? Because black is about as dark as tint as you can. It will turn all the pixels black instead of tinting them. So usually when you want to tint your image that you're painting, have a lighter value color. It doesn't have to be white, of course. If you want it to have a red tint, you could have that. In this case, this fits pretty close. But you'll notice that I could still just use viewplane with this. And you see how it just kind of drops that image down? So like I said, you might even find, maybe turn that spacing down a little bit to like say 40%. So you'll find that you can actually, of course, paint with viewplane still, right? With this. And it might even be what you lay down the core kind of pattern with, because it's easy and it's kind of got a nice little randomized effect on it. But you will notice that viewplane can, of course, paint just like this did. Drop, 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 because you'll see it's dropping that image down as it paints, right? You'll see that anchored works with this as well, right? So see how you could drop anchored on here with this? So you notice how stencil is awesome, but it's not the only way you could paint with texture, right? But in this case, I do feel like I do want to use it a little bit more, so I'll turn back to space. We'll bring that spacing back down to about 10%. But you can even overlap stuff, right? Because we're kind of working with outlayers because we don't really have bpainter. And so there's a free layered one I've used, but it's not really that great, so I'm kind of like, So in this case, what we could do is we could tell our mapping to not be viewplane, but be stencil. And remember, that's the one that brings the image up, right? And then right mouse button moves it, Control right mouse button rotates it. Shift right mouse button scales it. You see I can kind of rotate a little bit, move it, maybe make my brush size a little smaller. And then I could actually specifically paint a very specific section of this on top of that. So you see I'm painting exactly the part of it I want. Remember, right mouse button moves it. Left mouse button paints. Remember, your zoom will not work with this because right mouse button works for it, so use scroll wheel unless you change the quick keys for that, which I actually did at home, but there we go. Rotate around a little bit. Maybe move that. Maybe make my brush size a little smaller, paint that. And you notice how now there's actually kind of a bit more of the exact image. You're having that long streaking, right? You notice that when you used kind of just the regular view plane, it added some nice randomization here and there, but it also was almost too much randomization, right? Whereas in this case, we really like the long streak, right, in this. So you can always go in with some view plane to lay down, right, kind of a lot of great randomized stuff and get it covered pretty quickly. And then use stencil to kind of go in and kind of paint over a lot of that, or some of it, with the very specific stuff you wanted. So stencil is really good at allowing you to paint exactly the image, right? Because your image is right there, and you're painting exactly the part of the image you want. Whereas viewplane, with things like spacing adjusted or anchored, it's letting you kind of drop it down. Although anchored would do that okay as well. But it's kind of, you've got a lot of different ways to approach it with stencil mapping or your different kind of strokes. And it's one of the things that you could see that Blender's pretty good at this, right? And of course I could go to texture and I could hit X to get rid of that. And now we've got some horn texturing. I'm going to save that, and I'm also just going to go to save image. There we go. Remember, it packs in to Blender when you save the scene, right? But you still have to save your image, right? So you go to image here, save. It's one of the quickest ways to do it. That's why I keep the UV editor open a little bit here. I have it actually at smaller at home in BPainter because BPainter automatically does all that stuff for you when you just save, right? But remember, save your actual texture, right? If I wanted to, I could do a little bit of dodging and burning, right? So I'm going to switch back to view plane here for regular so that my navigation's normal. Remember, one of the things you can actually do as well is turn the strength down on this brush, and you'll I'm trying to remember where they're at. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So used to it in BPainter. One of the things that your brushes can do, and when you have BPainter, the layers will also do this as well. So like I said, if you're really serious about texturing a Blender, spend the $40 on BPainter. It's absolutely worth it. Great add-on by Andreas. So right here in the brushes, though, because we're just using the regular draw brush, if I go to mix here, you will see that there are blend modes, right? So if I wanted to, I could go to multiply, give it a low strength, because I always like to build it up more, pick a darker color, probably get my brush size a little smaller, and what happens is you see how kind of it darkens without painting, because things like multiply or color dodge, they don't paint black. What they do is they darken the pixels underneath them, right? So what you could do is you could go and you could actually accentuate some areas that you want to be a little bit darker pixel-wise, right? So you can kind of see I accentuate the cracks a little bit. Obviously, you could have baked like ambient occlusion out or cavity from text tools, because text tools has great baking features for those from the sculpting. But also, you know, it's great to be able to just manually do exactly what you want. You could, of course, switch to color dodge, right? Which can lighten up some of your pixels, right? So you see things like dodge, burn, multiply. They're not painting white or black. What they're doing is they're lightening or darkening the pixels that are already there. So you actually have blend modes on here. Some of you guys remember that Mudbox really only had a dodge and burn brush, right? It had like 5. Blender fully, like most other packages, gives you a bunch of the different blend modes that you'd expect for layers in Photoshop, right? So once again, like, even though I really feel like the Blender does need a proper layer system, and BPainter should be its model for it if they do eventually add it, B Painter is a great add-on, and it really takes a core good painting tool set that is quite good, and it gives it the proper layer system it needs. But the actual core painting in Blender, the actual paint tools themselves, are pretty darn good, and are quite feature rich, right? Obviously here and there you want a little more stuff, but you've got a good base here. Yeah. So now we can see that we've got this nice little bit of extra kind of that. See how that iron with a little bit of dodging and burning actually works to kind of look like bone or horn? And it was an iron texture, right? That was metal. So do not be constrained by what you think should be a texture. If it looks cool and it looks interesting and you're like, hey, that might work as that, try it as that, right? The cool thing about 3D is you can Control Z, you can undo. All right. So now I feel like we're good with this guy and covered a lot of the texture painting things I wanted to do. I do want to do a little bit of gear, so we can kind of finish that up on Thursday and then quickly light and render it. So I'm going to go to gear here, right? And we'll just go to 4 for object mode. Turn the eyeball on for gear so we can see our gear. I'm going to turn the quad body off for the moment. Make sure everything's selected. There we go. All right. And so what we want to probably do here, because we'll basically do some texture painting here. We'll do a little more texture painting on Thursday. I'll show you how to do transparency and metal maps again, and we'll do some quick lighting and rendering. But of course, what we need to do is we need to start off by giving ourselves a new texture for this one, right? So if we go to the red kind of magenta sphere down here, you see that there's the quad gear material, right? Because you can put different materials on stuff, but quad gear is already assigned to this one. And you see there's no base color texture in there. So what we could easily do is just click on the yellow dot for the base color. Remember, these can all be adjusted just for color, though. So if you just wanted the thing to be whole one solid color without any nuance, you could just pick a color, right? But I want to actually paint a texture for it. So I'm going to click on the, remember, just the little red kind of magenta sphere here. Of course, you can see this stuff in shading as well, right? There's quad gear. There's all those same controls, but you can kind of drop nodes in and plug them in. Go back to texture paint. But you don't always have to, right? You can kind of just approach it this way. So click on the yellow dot for base color, and you'll see it brings up the options. One of them is image texture. There we go. And you see what it does is it brings up our ability to make a new image, right? So we can click on new, and it brings up this, right? And we can call this, I can always save it later on too. We can call this, quad gear color. And we also want this to be a little bit bigger than a 1024. Obviously, the better your machine, the higher the resolution you could do. Just for your guys' sakes, we'll do a 2048 by 2048. Blank's fine. If you wanted the texture to be higher quality, 32-bit will be a nicer quality texture, but it'll also be a higher data amount, right? It'll be a bigger file size. So we'll just keep 32-bit off just to, keep your devices running, basically. But the nice thing is there are options. There's no right or wrong. It just depends on what you need. If you need more efficiency, just leave it kind of the default 8-bit, right? You might have some minor quality issues when you zoom in pretty close, but it'll look pretty nice most of the time in most situations. All right, so we'll hit OK. There we go. And now we've got a texture plugged into here. And in fact, we should see it over here as well. Right now you can kind of see the other layers. Although remember, if you go back up to your wrench screwdriver, right? I'm not seeing it there. What's going on? Back. All right, news there. Make sure it's selected. Okay. What's going on? I've got it created. Let's see here. Double check that it's showing up there. You might just need to make sure it's turned on here as well. Sometimes it gets stuck. So you can go into your UV editor and texture paint, and you'll see that there's a little browser here, and we could pick our quad gear color there as well. And then I feel like we should see it there. I'm not seeing it there yet. Probably have to fill some color on it first. But remember, that's where we kind of also want to start to figure out, hey, I want to maybe adjust some of this a little bit. So what we could do is we could, of course, go to Fill Bucket. And I like to fill it in here. So make sure your paint's on here in the 2D paint space. Make sure fill bucket's on. I'm going to go to color here, and I'm going to pick kind of a brown, but we'll make it kind of a lighter brown. And then we can click fill bucket in there. And now the image has been changed, right? There's actually pixels, because that's what the problem was. It was showing black because there really weren't, we hadn't properly filled in any pixels yet. So now we've got proper pixels in there. We can go to image, right? And we could save, or even save as if we just want to rename it. Looks like that's good though. And you could technically, if you want to go 16-bit, not full 32-bit, you could do it right here when you're saving it. And you have multiple file formats, right? PNG is a good default, but you'll see there's JPEGs, OpenEXR, Targa, supports different formats. We'll just use the defaults to keep it simple for you guys. So save as image, and there we go. And now you'll see it actually shows up here, right? So if you want to switch back and forth here, you could do that. So we can always kind of minimize that a little bit. And now you can see we've kind of got our starting point for that. Now, of course, this might be a little bit shiny, although we want some shininess on this. So go back to the blue or the magenta sphere. And we can always bring our specular amount down a little bit and bring our roughness up for now, just to kind of make it a little more muted. We can always adjust it later on. And of course, we could always do some quick fill-in stuff if we wanted to, right? Remember, one of the cool things we could do is we can go to 3 for face mode still. And I could easily go in here and select those guys, select linked, right? Remember, your select menu will show up here, select linked. I could go back to 8 for texture paint, turn this one on, right, because that's our little paint mask for faces. I could go pick a better color that's kind of much closer to kind of eyeball color. And we can click on that to fill that. And then, of course, we go to 3, and maybe I'll select these fabrics really quick. Select linked. 8. And you notice because this is still on, that's automatically available. And I'll go kind of more of a lighter fabric color. So we do want it to be a fabric, but we'll kind of make it just kind of lighter than the other one was. And I can fill those in. And then, of course, I can go back to 3, and we can even grab these. Now, remember, because we have seams on here, the select linked will work based on those seams, which is actually, when you get used to it, it's kind of cool. So I can select those, hit 8. And then I'm going to go pick much more of kind of a metalish color, right? And we're going to get it much more into kind of that grayish color. Boom. So remember, with this on and a specific face selection, that's face mask. And your fill bucket will acknowledge that, right? So now when I turn this off, you see how we're quickly able to actually drop in some core colors for certain parts of our model, right? And of course, we can go to image save, and we could save this so it saves all the stuff in there. Now, obviously, we're going to do a little bit more on Thursday, but now you can start to see how it all comes together. Remember, if you want to, you can kind of turn your light on. Make sure scene lights are on here, right? And then what I do is I usually click on the light there, and we can change it to sunlight and probably turn its intensity down to, like, say, 30. And now you see how you can actually see lighting for this and shadows. W will, of course, move. E will rotate. And so, believe it or not, if you make sure your light's visible in the scene, right, and maybe you go to the light bulb icon here, because when it's selected, you see the green turns into a light bulb icon. You change it to sun, make its intensity lower. But you can also just have scene lights available on in this little pull down for your view. And this is a great way to kind of just see how the full lighting is going to look on the model, right? And you can actually leave that on, right? It's not like you can't have it off. So you can leave it on if you want to. Eevee's pretty good at that stuff. Turn it off for now, though. And now we can see slowly we're kind of getting together this texture painting. All right, that'll be a great place to stop for today.